Now, I wanted to comment, to build on Adam's point yesterday in this earlier session of this group, that collaboration should be regarded as an output, and comment on that. And also to pick up on Claudia's point that transformation requires pain. That has led me to think that to remind myself that failure is one of the best teachers. Frustration is not so bad either, and that looking for places where where we're not doing well is an important thing to think about in these conversations. And I'd like to comment on the skill of boundary spanning in the science policy interface world. We do know, I think, after the last 20 years, some of the characteristics of boundary spanning. I think we've all taken aboard the salience, credibility, legitimacy idea. We have gained a lot of practice about designing boundary objects, and I think in institutional settings like RISA, we've developed a lot of knowledge about how to be accountable in boundary spanning to different communities, to the researchers on one side and to the users on the other side, and how to handle the fact that the various constituencies have different concepts of what good enough knowledge is for their own practice. So there have been very substantial gains over the last 20 years in understanding what the task is. In the course of that time, many of us have acquired reputations for knowing how to do this, and I want to share with you my uncertainty about whether that's deserved. So we've learned a lot. It's not clear what that is that we've learned. And more generally, I think that we do not know how to do science policy boundary spanning in a reliable fashion, and we don't know how to assure that people who have this skill are put into boundary spanning positions. So it's not clear what the skill set is, and we don't have a good mechanism to assure that people who have this skill set are inserted into the critical positions in between. And I want to make two remarks about that, really the pools of questions that I wanted to share with you. The first is that I think we've not talked much about the critical role of tacit knowledge. Now, Adam Paris yesterday brought up the way in which the handling of the science policy interface requires judgment in almost every direction that you look in. And implied in the word judgment is a great deal of knowledge that sometimes the person exercising judgment doesn't even know that he or she is exercising. Okay? So the term tacit knowledge, just to take a little side road, means skills that are not necessarily, can't be reduced to a recipe, and yet their effect is very observable. So an example is playing the violin. If you asked a violinist to reduce what she is doing into an algorithm when she's playing a Bach partita, can't be done. You can't get a machine. You can get a machine to record it, but you can't get a machine to produce it yet. And in particular, you can't get a machine to play in a string quartet. To listen to that dynamic interaction. And yet, all of us know when we are in the presence of bad instrumentalists, at least all of us who are parents in the room, and what something sounds like when it's not right. Okay, so and I believe that the exercise of judgment has a very large component of tacit knowledge, and that what we have learned over the last 20 years about boundary spanning, a lot of it is in the form of tacit knowledge. Now, if tacit knowledge is hard to communicate, how do you improve that capacity if you have this 8,200 people that you're trying to work with, for example, in the most recent example? How would you impart that knowledge to them? Okay, so some of the knowledge is not tacit; it's explicit. You can, give them rule books, training, various kinds of training, and so on. But the judgment formation, that's really tough. And I've come to believe over the last year that the way you improve tacit knowledge skills is through coaching. That's a long conversation I don't want to get into. I just want to mention the word coaching. That it's important to, in that relationship, in that learning relationship, for the coach and the person being educated or coached to build trust. Now, building trust is something that's really difficult to figure out how to scale, but so I raise that as a challenge, and particularly some of the old dogs in the extension service, it might be hard to convince them to trust. And what the coach is doing is observing what the person being coached is doing. So it's a matter of accelerating the learning by doing process and of giving feedback about what you observe as a coach. And it's important usually for coaching to be separated from management. So the coach should not be your organizational superior, because if you get the coaching entangled with evaluation, that can foul up the learning process a lot. So tacit knowledge is, I think, and judgment is an important problem to the extent that the boundary spanning is critically reliant on certain kinds of judgment. How much is that? That's a research question. That's something that I think we really need to think about. How would you even try to answer that question? All right, second set of questions. How do you get the right people into the right roles? And that to me is a question about the elements of reputation and how people move in their careers, how they move along, gaining reputations as boundary spanners. Now, the experience of the people in this room who have succeeded in this is that they have acquired sizable reputations without necessarily being promoted on the basis of them. So that's, which I think is a critical part of the challenge that we face. So the first part of reputation is who gets access, who gets to play the role in the first place, and what kind of domain knowledge do they have to have. So as Adam reminded us earlier today, we're importing all of the problematic aspects of the science issues into this discussion a lot. The Sarowitz article, I think, accelerates that in some ways. But, and so an implicit ground rule of science policy interface is you better have people who know a lot about science and are carrying credibility. The proportion of PhDs in this room, for example, is so far above the average of rooms in Aspen, Colorado, or probably rooms in Colorado, that's an implicit marker of this. A second criterion is prior experience. Have you done this before? Are you trusted by the people who are going to be stakeholders in those two communities? How do you acquire reputation for both prompt results and delayed results? Because certainly the production of knowledge, as I was trying to say yesterday, produces a lot of delayed results. And how do you evaluate a boundary spanner who makes something happen? You can get an output, but was that really a good output? Well, it's hard to know that oftentimes. And so how does that accumulate? What should a boundary spanner be, a problem solver or a facilitator of other people's problem solving? Well, generally, my experience is you do both, and you need both. But those are, again, distinct skills if you think about it from a social process perspective. And finally, how do you get to the stage of holding accountable the people who are in boundary spanning roles? And yesterday I was raising this stink about what leadership in networks looks like. I think if process is going to be an output, as Adam proposed, and I agree with, we have to figure out a way of judging when the process is a good process. And I submit that we don't have a very good grasp of that, and that a lot of that is still in the realm of tacit knowledge. So let's think about those questions going forward, especially if Anne is going to be a champion of the idea that numbers of people in the thousands are going to be the target of whatever this retraining and repurposing is going to be about.
So just one maybe clarifying question before we move on. Anybody? Okay, great. So for right now, Shally. Oh, did I miss someone? No, okay.
I was going to just ask a really quick thing about
Okay.
What you were saying about the the expectations that we have of process, if process is an outcome. Well, this could turn into a very long conversation, and it shouldn't, but I feel like there are a few things to sort of disaggregate there, because there's, it's also been said, maybe even you said, that having, it's okay to have vague goals because you have unexpected outcomes along the way. And this is something I've struggled with quite a lot, which is we have this sort of this intuitive sense of what a good process is and where we're trying to get to, and then all sorts of other crap happens.
Right, that's right.
So I don't know if you have any sort of
Well,
initial thoughts about
the
how
social
to do that.
mechanism that's operative, that seems to be working quite well, is a kind of venture capital model. If you're expecting good things, what's the reasonable frequency, and how do you parcel out your resources so that you get the good, huge, big, good result often enough, okay? Which means you don't evaluate the individual boundary spanning activity. What you do is you say, we're going to put a portfolio out there in the expectation that something really big and really good is going to happen. So that's one way of thinking about that.
Bringing that there on a one-on-one coaching relationship seems more difficult.
Absolutely, absolutely, and those are the kinds of challenges that the successful production of a boundary object is what as good a proxy as I know of right now. Okay, did you get the study finished? Did you build a computer model? Was there a user there at the end? There's the user, and then was there use? Is there use is something that can be a whole lot harder to assess at the end of this process. That's a delayed impact often. Anyway, you're right, there's a long conversation.